Amelia thought the hostel would be a fresh start, a quiet, affordable place to focus on her studies in the city. But from the moment she walked in, she felt uneasy. The building was old and silent, with dim hallways and an oppressive stillness that didn't make sense. The few residents she saw kept their heads down, moving quickly and avoiding eye contact. At first, she tried to dismiss it as her imagination, a trick of being in an unfamiliar place. But soon, she began noticing the signs, the feeling of being watched, faint sounds of movement when no one was there, and a dark, shadowy figure that lingered at the edges of her vision. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Someone was there, and he was watching her. Amelia arrived at the hostel with a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was an old building with tall windows and ornate, weathered detailing on the exterior. She had chosen it for its affordability, ignoring the somewhat lackluster reviews, convinced it would be just a temporary stop. She lugged her suitcase up the creaky stairs leading to the front desk, where she found a disinterested receptionist who handed her the room key without so much as a smile. The interior of the hostel felt strange. The hallways were eerily quiet, and the yellow lighting cast unsettling shadows along the peeling wallpaper. As Amelia walked to her room, she noticed that the doors lining the hall were all tightly shut, with no signs of life. It struck her as odd, but she brushed the thought aside, telling herself the other residents were likely keeping to themselves. Her room was small but functional. A narrow bed pushed against the wall, a desk, and a small wardrobe. She immediately noticed the faint smell of dampness and saw a crack running along the ceiling, but it was nothing she couldn't tolerate for the price. After unpacking her belongings and settling in, she decided to explore the building. The layout of the hostel was peculiar. Some hallways seemed to loop back in confusing ways, and certain doors didn't have numbers, as though they were meant to remain unnoticed. She passed an old bulletin board covered in faded notices, their ink blurred with age, and a single locked door at the end of one hallway. The heavy padlock on it caught her attention, but she didn't linger, feeling a strange chill the longer she stared. By the time Amelia returned to her room, the sun had set, and the building seemed even quieter than before. She lay in bed, scrolling through her phone, but couldn't shake the feeling of unease. At some point in the night, she woke up to a sound, a faint shuffling outside her door. Her heart thudded as she held her breath, listening intently. The noise stopped, and the silence returned, but it left her feeling exposed and unsettled. The next morning, the unease persisted. She tried to dismiss it as the nerves of being in a new environment. As she ventured to the dining area, she noticed a few other residents. They sat alone, eating quietly, their eyes fixed on their plates. No one exchanged greetings or even looked up. The atmosphere was heavy, like everyone was carrying an invisible burden they refused to acknowledge. Amelia told herself it was just an odd place with eccentric tenants. She had dealt with worse. But as she continued her day, the feeling of being watched became impossible to ignore. There was something off about this place, something she couldn't explain, and it was only the beginning. Amelia decided to shake off her unease and focus on her studies. The hostel was a means to an end, and she wasn't about to let its strange atmosphere distract her. After breakfast, she unpacked the rest of her belongings and spent the afternoon organizing her room. She opened the window for fresh air, hoping it would clear the heaviness she felt. But even with the sunlight streaming in, the room felt oppressively still. As the day went on, she began noticing subtle oddities. The door to her wardrobe creaked open slightly, even though she was sure she had closed it tightly. A folded piece of clothing she'd left on the desk had fallen to the floor, though there was no draft strong enough to move it. She chalked it up to her imagination or the quirks of an old building, unwilling to let paranoia take over. Determined to understand her surroundings, she explored the hostel again. The confusing layout frustrated her. She wandered into hallways she didn't remember seeing before. Some areas were dimly lit, and the faint hum of a flickering bulb in the corner only heightened her unease. One hallway led her to a door with no number, slightly ajar. Inside, she saw an empty room with broken furniture piled in one corner and an old mirror leaning against the wall. The sight of her distorted reflection in the cracked glass made her shiver. It was then that she saw him for the first time. At the end of the hallway stood a man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face obscured by shadows. His presence was unmistakable. He stood still, his head slightly tilted, as though studying her. Amelia froze, her heart pounding. She tried to convince herself he was just another resident, but something about his stance and silence unnerved her. When she glanced back toward him after looking away for a moment, he was gone. The rest of the day passed in a haze of unease. Amelia avoided the hallways and kept her door locked. That night she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The faint sound of footsteps outside her room returned. She clutched her phone, debating whether to call someone for help, but the sound stopped before she could act. The following morning, her unease turned into outright fear. She found a small piece of paper slipped under her door. The words scrawled on it in uneven handwriting were chilling. "You don't belong here." She stared at it for a long moment, her breath quickening. Who had written it? Why? Her initial instinct was to leave immediately, but where would she go? She had no backup plan, no other accommodation lined up. The uneasy silence of the hostel pressed down on her as she realized she might be trapped. Amelia couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something was very wrong. The man she had seen was not just another resident. She was certain of that now. His presence wasn't fleeting. It lingered, unsettling and invasive, even when he wasn't in sight. She began noticing small changes in her room that she couldn't explain. The window latch, which she always kept locked, was open one morning. A drawer she never used was partially pulled out. She started avoiding the common areas altogether. The few residents she had seen before were now almost invisible. The dining room was empty whenever she visited, and the hallways seemed more deserted than ever. She felt completely isolated, her only company being the ever-present sensation of being watched. One afternoon, she decided to take a closer look at the hostel's layout. The building was old, and there had to be something she was missing, a hidden exit, a clue to explain its strange design. As she retraced her steps, she noticed how uneven the numbered doors were, with some missing entirely. She came across a locked door at the end of one hallway, its brass handle tarnished. Amelia pressed her ear to it, her breath catching as she thought she heard faint shuffling on the other side. The man appeared again that evening. This time, he was closer. She caught sight of him standing at the end of the hallway as she returned to her room. His face was partially illuminated by the dim light, revealing deep-set eyes and a sharp, almost gaunt expression. He didn't move, didn't speak. Amelia rushed into her room, locking the door and pushing a chair under the handle. Her fear reached its peak when she found another note in her room that night, despite her precautions. It was placed on her desk, as though whoever left it had stood inside her room. This time, the message read, "Leave. Now." Amelia's hands shook as she held the note. Her sense of safety was completely shattered. Amelia's attempts to leave the hostel were met with strange obstacles. Whenever she tried to book another place, the websites wouldn't load, or her payment methods failed. Her phone seemed to act up every time she searched for help. It felt as though the hostel itself was working against her, tightening its grip. One evening, determined to uncover the truth, Amelia ventured into the unexplored parts of the building. Her search led her to a narrow staircase tucked behind a disused storage area. The stairs descended into a dark, damp-smelling corridor. At the end was a door that looked sturdier than the others, with scratches along its surface as though someone had tried to claw it open. Inside, she found a room that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. On one wall were photos of young women, some smiling, others looking nervous. Her blood ran cold as she realized they were former residents. Below each photo was a name and a date. Her panic grew as she spotted her own photo, taken without her knowledge, pinned among the others. Below it was today's date. She staggered back, her pulse racing, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. She turned to leave, but heard heavy footsteps behind her. The man was there, blocking her exit. He stepped forward slowly, his expression unreadable. Amelia acted on instinct, pushing past him and running back up the stairs. She didn't stop until she reached her room, slamming the door shut and barricading it once more. Amelia knew she couldn't stay another night. Her fear of the man watching her had turned into sheer terror. She packed a small bag and tried the exits, but each one was locked. The emergency exit was blocked by heavy furniture and the front door wouldn't budge. The man appeared again, this time in the main hallway. His eyes bore into hers as he began walking toward her. Amelia's breath hitched, and she turned and ran, her heart pounding as she retraced her steps through the building's confusing layout. She reached the hidden staircase again, hoping to find another way out. In the dimly lit room below, she found something she hadn't noticed before, a ledger on the table. It listed the names and dates of past residents, all of whom seemed to have disappeared. Her name was the last entry, with the current date beside it. The sound of the man descending the stairs jolted her into action. She grabbed the ledger and ran for her life. She used every ounce of strength to push past furniture blocking the emergency exit, finally breaking free into the cold night air. She didn't stop running until she reached a police station. Despite her detailed account and the evidence she presented, the authorities found no trace of the man or the disturbing room. The hostel closed down a month later, leaving its secrets buried. Amelia moved on, but the memory of the man and his unyielding gaze stayed with her, a haunting reminder of how close she had come to disappearing forever.